Hello and welcome. If the lever is placed right, a small force is able to move a big object. Ukraine has such a lever with its naval drones. In this video, we are going to talk about how Ukraine with its naval drones might be able to get Russia's economy, maybe not to its knees, but to damage it substantially. We'll talk about this in this video. Ukraine has started to use remotely controlled suicide naval drones basically after a few months into the war. First, one of those drones was caught beached here close to Sevastopol and later destroyed by the Russians, but then successful and a lot of unsuccessful attacks followed on the shipping close to and in Sevastopol. Since then, the evolution of the Ukrainian naval drones has continued, as we can see here, with various different versions. By the way, this is from H.I. Sutton, whom I want to recommend in this regard. They have continued, but in the last few weeks, we've seen 3 spectacular attacks. First, the attack on the Kerch Bridge with several naval drones, likely started from Snake Island, that have shown that Ukraine has the range to strike basically across the Black Sea, even though the amount of coastline it still controls is fairly limited. After that, there was this attack on a landing ship tank of the Russian Black Sea Fleet that was hit in this naval drone attack, a full-fledged warship that afterwards was seen with heavy list, even though it made it in the harbor and can probably be repaired in some time. And after this, we've seen this year a successful Ukrainian attack on a Russian tanker that is in use or in military use, the SIG. The SIG was used to ship aviation fuel to the Russian forces in Syria. It was sanctioned because of this, and Ukraine has shown it is capable and willing to attack ships like this. Why is this important? Because naval drones, as we can see here, are fairly small. Thus, they are easy to produce, fast to produce, and they have a low signature, a low radar signature. Unlike regular ships, they don't have masts, bridges, etc. that are far visible over the horizon with radar systems. They are small, barely over the waterline. They have barely size over the waterline, thus are a small radar signature. They can even hide in between waves to be invisible until very short notice. This allows them a high chance of getting close into their target, and once they are spotted, then the Russian means to fight them is fairly limited. Classic anti-ship missiles, ASM, will no longer be able to be employed, even if they are even capable of striking such a small target, as the distance to the ship will be too small. This will limit the Russians to regular ballistic weapons like machine guns, machine cannons, and their shipborne cannons. As we can see an example here, this is the NATO use, the Italian Ottomalera 76 millimeter, an example of cannons that are being used on ships. In this regard, they are capable of shooting below the horizon. We see the Ottomalera, for instance, can aim down 15 degrees, but this will be limited to the position on the ship, as both the height of placement as well as how wide the ship is will obviously create some kind of dead angle where the cannon will no longer be able to engage anything that comes closer. Limiting once the naval drone has crossed that area where the cannon can engage it, the Russian crew will be limited to its automatic weapons to fight them, to try to destroy them. The time they have to react is fairly limited here. If we assume they are spotted at 1 kilometer range with 30 knots, it only takes 65 seconds to cross 1 kilometer. Should they be able to do 40 knots, it's 49 seconds. That's all that the Russians would have from an initial warning until an impact at a stationary target, at least against a stationary target. That doesn't assume yet swarm attacks. That doesn't assume that the drones might be in the way of the ships and coming frontally ahead at them, thus reducing the time to react even further, and a speed higher than 40 knots is far from being unachievable as well. So in total, the amount of measures the Russians have to fight them is limited. The distances make it hard to engage it successfully, the warning time is limited, and the Russians would have to be on alert all the time to have a high chance, and this is exhausting and thus close to impractical. While the Russians have a decent chance of taking out those drones, there will not be a 100% success quote. Some of them will come through. Why is this so important now? Well, the Ukrainians have, after the Russian strikes on the Ukrainian grain infrastructure, on the harbors, they have declared, we could probably call it some kind of naval blockade for the Russian harbors. Basically, they said from the 23rd of August on, any civilian ship that is going for the Russian harbors here, 6 harbors in Russia on the Black Sea coast, will be considered to be a military target, everything coming from there as well. This means that all civilian ships are now in danger, especially after Ukraine has demonstrated that they are capable of striking those ships. This makes insurance for neutral countries impossible, even if a neutral country, even if a neutral ship owner is willing to go there, he will not get an insurance. Thus, it will be prohibited to go there and take up cargo. We have to mention here that this is likely a war crime. The price or the regulation in naval warfare require that the civilian crew on board of a ship has to be given the chance to leave the ship safely, and Ukraine, by hitting it with drones, will obviously not give them the chance. It is clearly in context with Russian actions against civilian shipping in Ukrainian harbors, and in the end, it is in context of a war where a lot of war crimes are committed. So the amount of backslash Ukraine will suffer from that will be, to be honest, will probably be very limited to negligible at all. So generally, once the civilian shipping, neutral civilian shipping, is taken out, this leaves only Russian ships under government control or that can be pressured by the government to ship cargo. And this is an important thing because the Black Sea harbors are one of the main points for crude oil to be shipped out of Russia. We have a map here. You can ignore the red lines. They are for natural gas. So only the green lines are relevant. And when we can see all the big fields here, we have more or less one connection going to the east into Manchuria and to Vladivostok, where oil could be pumped, but they have their own fields in this area, so that the capacity, excess capacity to bring something from the northern Siberian oil fields into close to the Pacific Ocean or here into China should be close to nil. This leaves all the oil that's being produced here to either go through Kazakhstan, for instance, and then the Caspian Sea, where it has to compete with the local oil from the inner Asian countries. But the majority of the Russian oil is being exported west, either here through the harbor close to St. Petersburg, through pipelines that cross Poland and Ukraine, 2 nations that are all too happy to bring Russia economically to its knees, and then the Black Sea coast. So if those harbors are taken out, if the Russians are no longer able to export all the oil that is coming there, they will have to react. First of all, their storage tanks will fill up. Once they are filled up, and the ones further inland are filled up, they have no choice basically but to turn off their oil wells. As crude oil has a certain amount of water in it, it's in the risk of freezing in cold temperature. Now we see the oil fields here being in regions close to the Arctic, basically being in permafrost. As soon as the oil stops flowing there, they start freezing up. The same is for pipelines. If the pipelines don't move the oil permanently, they start freezing up, and with the expansion of water, they will take damage that cannot be prevented. This leads to the Russian oil capacity, producing capacity, to being reduced once that is done, simply by the destruction of the oil wells, as the Russians have no choice but turning these wells off. Obviously, they can be repaired. The pipelines can also be repaired, but that will take years upon years. In the past, it happened with Western aid. It happened with Western aid. Obviously, Western companies it's highly unlikely that Western companies will come again to Russia to help Russia rebuild its oil infrastructure. And then the question is, will the Chinese be able to make up for these deficiencies? If we look here in the past, we see that the highest production had been in 1987 at 11.1 million barrels, so roughly up here. And after the end of the Soviet Union, it fell down to roughly 50% of the production capacity, and it only reached heights again as close to being previous, not even reaching the production from the Cold War from the Soviet Union in 2018. So if Russia cannot export the oil that's being produced, the oil wells will take damage. The oil pipelines will take damage, and that will cripple Russia's oil economy significantly. That will damage it at least significantly, and it'll take years, if not a decade or more, to recover from. So even once the war is over, whether it's won by Russia or not, the damage will still be felt in Russia, especially as there are some calculations that up to 60% of its exports are crude, are carbohydrates. And this is not everything, though. Russia is right now exporting and giving cheap oil as it has to compete in, they're not allowed to sell it at certain prices, as they have to sell it to whoever is willing to still buy from them. Generally, the Russian oil is being sold with a big discount so far. This keeps the buying nations happy. If they are no longer able to buy it and thus help their own economy with getting cheap oil to boost their own economy, one political reason to stay neutral in this war is gone at that very moment. This doesn't necessarily mean that nations like China or India, which were so far buying 90% of the shipped oil from Russia, the oil that didn't leave Russia with pipelines. Last year, 90% of it was sold to India and China. That doesn't necessarily mean that both of them will start siding with Ukraine, but both of them will increasingly move away from their current position and have higher incentives to pressure Russia to find a fast conclusion for this war, while smaller nations might even switch sides completely if they get financial incentives from the West. Overall, this is a bad outcome and a bad expectation in the Russian regard. It's far from certain that it will happen. Maybe Russia will be able to create an efficient naval convoy system where they are able to escort the ships sufficiently out so this never becomes a problem. We are far from a certainty, but Ukraine has the chance to do disproportionate damage here with a few fairly cheap naval drones in the Black Sea. Especially ironic that we're talking about a nation that basically has no navy anymore, which is coming close to imposing a naval blockade on its enemy. If you find this video interesting, I'd be happy. It would be nice if you leave a thumbs up, leave a comment for the algorithm. Also, what do you think about the situation? Do you think the Russians will be able to export the oil regardless, despite the pipeline structure being to their disadvantage? And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. So if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you very much to everyone already supporting this channel. And that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.